Hello. Welcome to session 3 for Alteryx Designer Training. In the first session, we covered the basics of Alteryx Designer, the layout, things like that. Then we went ahead and covered the in-out section, bringing data into and out of the canvas. The preparation section, which showed you some of the manipulation techniques that you can use. In session 2, we talked about the join tools, blending data sets together. And we talked about the parsing section. And this is breaking strings out and working with date times. Today, we're going to focus on the transformation section, which has the summarize tool, which allows you to group data together, summarize, concatenate, things like that. The crosstab tool, and the transpose tool. The crosstab and the transpose tool allow you to pivot data, making columns into rows and rows into columns. As with the other classes, I've attached a zip file to this training, which has a data input section. And these are going to be the different data files that we're going to use in the course today. More than we're going to use is kind of a standard set that I use in my trainings. A data output section, if you want to write anything, gives you a structured place to put it. Some of the graphics that I use today. The template file, and that'll be the file that we're actually working with today. And a data transformation file, which is kind of the answer key. Now, everybody can go ahead and double click the template, which will bring it up, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, so this is our template file. If it didn't pull up for some reason, you can always go to File, Open Workflow, and navigate directly to that workflow and open it that way. Okay. Now, as with a lot of our other training, we will, of course, start with the in-out section, and we're going to go ahead and bring a data set in. So let me go ahead and set up a connection. I'm going to go to Files, select a file, and we are going to bring in Colorado sales data and open that. Right. Now, I hope by this time bringing in data has become pretty commonplace, fairly straightforward. Now I'm going to run that. And when we look at our output, looks good. When I click on the metadata, which we've done before, you'll note that because this is a CSV, everything is brought in as a V string. And for the purposes of what I'm going to do, I actually want to work with numbers. So let me go to the preparation section. I'm going to grab a select tool and drag that down. And I'm going to go ahead and change the total sales to a double, the credit sales to a double, the total customers to a double. Because these are going to be the numbers that we're going to be working with. All right, let me go back to the data radial here. And when I run it, you actually won't see any difference. But when you look at the output, those have been changed to a data type of data as opposed to a data type of text. All right. Now let's go to the transformation section, and we'll bring down our summarize tool. Now, the summarize tool gives you a list of all the fields that you have to work with, and it tells you what the data type is because that is important. You can only do certain things with certain data types. And then down here is what you're actually going to do. So, in this particular data set that we've seen before, we have store numbers, and we have the sales information for each quarter. Quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, quarter 4. Now, In the past, we've done a variety of things. We've kind of ignored it when we were working with the joins so that we could see those multiple joins. We could go ahead and use the unique tool and just grab one. But in this situation, I'd like to look at the yearly information as opposed to just quarterly. So I want to aggregate everything together for each store. So I'm going to click I highlight the store, and I'm going to click the add, and I'm going to group by. And what that's going to do is it's going to group by store number. So if I have four entries for store 10153, it'll become a single entry. And if I run that, it just gives me a simple list of unique store numbers. Note 302 records on the output, 1,000 records on the input. Now, this in itself could be valuable if you're looking for a unique list of values in your data set. All right. I want more than just this, though. I want to get my total sales for the year. So I go ahead and select total sales, click add, and I just go to sum. Note, sum total sales. This is changeable. Maybe I don't want to have the sum in front of it, or maybe I want to call it something completely different. So you can change what this column is called. And now when I run it, I get the unique store numbers, 302 records, and I get the sum of the total sales. So it's taken all of the records for this store number and aggregated the sales. I could do the same thing with credit sales. Now for total customers, maybe I don't want the total customers. Maybe I want an average of the total customers. So I can go ahead and click add. And we just use these two right now. But I can come down here and I've got some other values that I can use or some other functions. Now note that they are dependent upon the data type. I'm in a number here, so there's numeric. I can go to average, run that. Now I've got the sum of my total sales, the sum of my credit sales, average total customers per quarter, obviously. Now maybe I'm also interested in how many quarters each store had, because there's a variety of ways to look at the information. So I can go ahead and I'll click on store number here because that was my group by here. I'll click add, and I'll get a count. Or you could do count non-null, distinct. So there's a variety of different counts. And I run that. And now I can actually see how many entries I had for each store. So this store had 4 quarters of information. This store only had 3 quarters of information. This store only had 2 quarters of information. Right? Different stores were developed or closed throughout the year. So depending upon what you're trying to do, this could be valuable information. All right. Now, let me go ahead and grab down another summarize tool here. And I'm going to drop that in, pull it from the main data source again. Now, note, everything is a V string now. Okay, we're not looking at the numbers anymore. So, I want to start the same way. I'm going to group by store number. Now, I could also group by multiple things if I wanted to. And so note, I could do store number and I could do county and I could do, whatever might be appropriate for your particular data set. So you could do multiple groupings. And now, to highlight the difference, I'm going to go total sales. And note that I cannot sum it anymore because it is a V string and not a number. But one of the things that I can do is I can concatenate it. So if I come down to the string down here, concatenate is a real common thing to use. And let me go ahead and select concatenate. Okay. Now, when you concatenate, you have your properties down here, which is what do you want at the very beginning, what do you want at the end, and what do you want to separate each value. Now, you might consider these things because at a later date, you might want to break this data out. So, for the separator, I'm going to go ahead and put a pipe in. Pipe is an unusual thing to find in data, and it's something that I can work with. Now I go ahead and run that. And you'll note that I've got my store, and each individual entry is now separated by pipes. Now, the reason I do it for pipes is kind of thinking ahead. Now, you could obviously come back and change it later. But if I go to the parsing section and drag out that text to columns that we talked about last time, I can go ahead and look at the concatenate total sales. My delimiter is going to be a pipe, which I did mention I specifically used. And when I run that, I'm effectively pivoting my data. So now I've got sales 1, 2, 3, 4 in individual columns for each store. So a couple of different ways of working with the data. We can go ahead and do basic aggregation and summation. And remember, there's a whole variety of different techniques that you can use: summing, averages, mean, mode, first, last, etc., etc. And in addition, you can work with text to go ahead and concatenate things. And so you can group together words or locations, and you can, concatenate unique, non-unique, whatever. And then, of course, you could just get a straight list of how many entries are in there. Perhaps you're looking at, your total sales, but you want to know how many times they were in the store, and then you want to get an average of how much they spent each time they were in the store. Yeah, so you get a total for the store, you get how many times they were in there, and then you do a quick division. All right. Let's move on, and let's talk about the crosstab. Oh, last thing I'll talk about with the summary tool is that we can delete things if we make a mistake here. Let's come up to this one, and maybe I don't want the count anymore. Highlight the count, and I can just get rid of it. And maybe I want to reorder things. I can take the total customers, and I can move those up. Right, so you have these right here that you can work with a little bit. All right, let's talk about the crosstab a little bit. So the crosstab has to do with pivoting data. Now, let me go to the transformation section. I'm going to go to the crosstab tool, and I'm going to open up an example. I run it because, well, it's a live example here. I love this picture. I copied this picture and put it into the training. This picture really helped me understand exactly how it was manipulating my data, how it was transforming the data. I have my grouping columns, I have my header columns, and I have my data columns. And it is going to pivot that. So I still have my grouping columns, but it's going to take those header columns and put them as headers, and the data columns and make it as data. Right? So functionally speaking, this allows you to get two columns of information put into multiple columns of information, lots of rows of data into much fewer rows. And if you kind of look at the picture here, it's transforming your columns into rows. We can look at the examples real quick, and I'll go ahead and leave these for you guys to play with because we'll use different examples, but they got great examples of actual data right here and how the tool is configured and manipulating it. All right, let's take a look at this data here. I'm going to go ahead and go to preparation, and I'm going to grab another select tool, and I'm going to connect it to the other select tool that I have up there. Right? And this is just to kind of arrange the data the way I want to arrange it. And for the purposes of simplicity here, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to remove these two columns here. So I just got store number, total sales, and the quarter. And then, of course, we talked about the unknown. New column comes in, it'll automatically come through here. Right? So I've reduced my data set. And if you look at the picture here, I've actually reduced it to our three columns. I've got my grouping data, which is the store number. I've got my column headers, which will be my quarters. And I've got my data columns, which will be my total sales. All right. Now, just so that you can kind of see everything, Alteryx doesn't need to do this, but it does help with us humans visualizing things. I'm going to go ahead and throw a sort tool in here, and I'm going to sort by store number, and I'm going to sort by quarter, so that you can just visualize it a little bit easier. Each store has 4 quarters of information. I shouldn't say that. Not every store has all 4 quarters, right? This store right here only has 2 quarters of information. It was created in the 3rd quarter. So let's go ahead and go to the transformation section. And let's grab a crosstab tool, drag that and connect that. All right. Now, the configuration here is so similar to the other tools. What are my groupings? And I could choose more than one grouping if I want. And I'm going to group by store number. Then I've got my column headers. And my column headers in this case are going to be quarter. And then total sales for total sales. Now, if there's a duplicate in here, it does require that you check something in order to move forward. So I'm going to check some. It'll give you an error if you don't. It won't do anything if everything is unique, but if you did have duplicates, I'm going to run this. And you'll see the data coming in. I've got my stores and my individual quarters. My data coming out. I've got a single entry for each store, 302 records, over 1,000 records. And then each quarter has been pivoted up, and the total sales has been put in the cell itself. So this allows you to kind of manipulate your data a little bit, right? And the types of reasons that I'd use this is, let's say that I want to get difference between quarter 3 and quarter 4, the most recent. If my data is coming in like this, that's tricky to do. I could do it. I got some tools. But if I pivot the data, it makes it a lot more straightforward. I go to preparation. I'm going to go ahead and start with a formula tool. Drag that down and hook that up. And in the formula tool, I'm going to create a quick formula. So I'm going to add a column. I'm going to go percent change. And then we'll say Q3, Q4. And then I'm going to go ahead and do that left square bracket, that cheat code. There's quarter 4. And I'm going to subtract minus, and that left square bracket again, quarter 3. And then I'm going to put all of that in parentheses, order of operations and all. And then I'm going to divide that, again, that left square bracket, by quarter 4. And since I'm looking for an actual percent, multiply that times 100. I'm going to leave it as a string because I'm not going to be doing anything. But, I can turn it into a fixed decimal or whatever. This will just give me a super long number. And now when I look at that, you can see, quarter 3 right here was pretty low. Quarter 4 was much higher, high percent change. I actually decreased my sales slightly here. There were a few stores that I get nulls because I didn't have those values in here. If I wanted to clean it up, I could throw a filter on here. And I could say, okay, the percent change column is not null. And run that. And that gets rid of those nulls. So you can see right here, I got valid percentages for everything. And if I look at my false anchor, here's all my nulls. Right? There are a variety of ways of doing this. I'm, highlighting just some of the tools and some of the possibilities of the things that you can do. All right, let's take this a step farther, and let's go ahead and do another example here. So, what I'm going to do is I want to get some totals for things. Right? I've got all my data here, and ultimately what I'm looking for is I want a totals column at the very end here. Now, I could certainly take this and I could, put a formula tool here and I could say, okay, let's add this column and let's add this column and let's add this column and let's add this column. But I'm going to do it a little bit differently. Right? And the different techniques that you're learning here are applicable in different situations for different reasons. Right? If I go ahead and just add these 4 columns up, when it changes, and maybe it's 2020, Q1, Q2, 3, 4, it's not going to work anymore because the formula tool is specifically looking at this column header. Right? So let me go ahead and I'm going to go to the transformation section again and grab down a summarize tool. And I'm going to hook it up. I could bring it from here, but I'm just going to hook it up from my sort tool there. And I'm going to group by store number. And I'm going to get total sales. And I'm going to sum it. Oops. Total sales, add, sum. Now I'm going to rename this. So actually, let me do this differently. Let me go ahead and I'm going to do quarter. I'm going to get quarterly sums and group by, and then move that up. Kind of an illustration of how we can change things. And I'm going to name that quarter, and I'm going to name the sum of the total sales just total sales. All right, I run that. Straightforward enough. I just get individual quarters and the total sales in there. Now, let me go ahead and grab a summary tool, a formula tool here. And what I'm doing is I'm trying to put my data sets together. So when I look at this, I've got my store numbers, I've got my total sales, and I have my quarters. Right? As we saw when we pivoted this, store number is going to be my constant here, my key. And then the sales information will be put into individual columns with those column headers. Now, if I'm going to create a totals column, I'm going to want the word total in the store number. And then I'm going to want the totals in each of my columns. So when I look at my data, I'm going to want the word total here. And then I have the total sales for each quarter. And when I look over here, I've got my quarters and I've got my total sales. So I'm already most of the way there. And what I'm going to do is in my formula tool, I'm going to go ahead and just add a column. And I'm going to call it store number. And in that, and it's a string, so I put it in quotes, I'm going to put the word total. And when I run that, note, quarter, total sales, store number, quarter, total sales, store number. Order doesn't matter, but I'm just trying to align my data properly. Now, I go to the join section, and I go ahead and grab a union tool. And in that union tool, I can auto-configure by name because I just created it. And when I run that, whoops, I need to add my other data to it. Let me grab my other data set there. And when I run that, I've got my individual stores, and then all the way at the bottom, I got my totals tacked onto the bottom. Now, when I go to my transformation section and I grab that crosstab tool, I'm going to group the data, and it's grouped by store number. My column headers will be quarter. Value for the new columns will be total sales. And obviously I have to sum if there's a duplicate there. I run that. Right? And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go to preparation. I'm going to drag a sort tool in. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sort on the store number, ascending. And I'm going to run that. And what I have here is I have my store numbers with their sales information. And all the way at the bottom of my data, I've now got that new totals column that's got the total for each individual quarter. Now, the nice thing about this is that if my quarters change, it won't matter. Note that when I'm looking at all of these tools, right, I did change, because it's so, I have this in here, so I did change a couple of things, but again, the quarters will be able to change. Quarters will be able to change. The quarters can change because I'm just calling that entire column, etc., etc., etc. So nowhere in here do I actually call out the quarter numbers. I just call out the column that has all the individual quarters in it. So when I go to 2020, 2021, 2022, this process will still work. So when I save this, I bring this up every quarter, I run it, it's going to go ahead and pivot my data and give me this exact same thing. And these column headers will change based upon whatever quarters I'm looking at. So it's a good way to protect the automation, to protect the reusability of the workflow, as opposed to just tossing in a formula tool, which every single time the quarters change, you have to go back into that formula tool and change them, or more likely you'd put a select tool in the beginning and you'd change them to something common here, and then every time you ran it, you'd have to look at your quarters and change them to your common ones again. So, great little technique here for doing something like that. All right. Let's go ahead and move on down here. And let's talk a little bit about the Transpose tool. So, I'm going to go to the in out section. I'm going to drag some input data in. I'm going to go ahead and set up a connection. Go to Files, select a file, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to grab the bookings. All right, comes through cleanly. Go ahead and run that. And here's all my bookings information. And I've got the individual years. I've got how many bookings that I've got on a monthly basis. Let me go ahead and go to the transform section. Right? And I'd like you to note that this basic format is pretty much this basic format, right? That chart style, table style information. So let me go to the Transpose tool, and I'm going to open an example here. And the Transpose tool takes your key columns, it'll take individual columns of data and column headers, and then it pivots that so that each column will be an individual row. And so it's literally the exact opposite of the crosstab tool. It's going to take a data set that has multiple columns and pivot it to have multiple rows. And you can kind of see that in the graphic there. It's taking your column data and turning it into lots of rows. Again, just like with the crosstab tool, multiple key columns if you want to. All right. So let's see how this actually works. So I brought in my bookings data, and let me grab that transpose tool and drag that down and drop that on the canvas. All right. And what are my key columns here? And in my particular situation, my key columns are only going to be the year. But again, like I said, you could choose multiple ones. My data columns down here, I'm going to choose everything. And again, you have the dynamic at the bottom so that if the months change, maybe they go to numbers, maybe they go to the full word, whatever, it'll automatically grab the new columns. And when I run that, note, I only have 10 records, 10 years of data, 12 months. My output, I now have 120 records. So each individual year has now been transformed into 12 months. So 12 rows of data for each year because it pivoted it down. There's April, there's August, and you can see that coming in. There's, year 2009, April, August, December, and each one now has its own individual rows. Now, why would I ever do this? Well, maybe I want to modify my data. Oh, look, I just happen to have a currency conversion here because perhaps this was in US dollars and I don't want in US dollars, or they're not in US dollars and I do want them in US dollars, something along those lines. All right. So I can go back to the join section, tools. Again, all these are tools that we learned in the prior classes. And I'm going to go ahead and drag down and append fields. And for my append fields, look at my source data here. All I want is the conversion. So I'm going to uncheck the currency there. I don't need the currency, just looking at conversions. And I run that. And I've tacked on my conversion to it. Go to preparation, grab a quick formula tool here. And in that formula tool, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add a new column. I will call it converted. For the purposes of this class, I'm just using kind of simple column headers, but obviously I would try to make them a little bit more detailed and descriptive as you're working with Alteryx so that they have a little bit more meaning to your company. Also, I would try to fix the columns that you're trying to create in whatever terms you guys want from the very beginning, rather than say putting a select tool at the end and then renaming all the columns or something like that. So that way, as you're looking at a workflow, as you're working with the workflow, it just makes it a whole lot easier to understand, right, throughout the whole thing. All right, so I do that left square bracket. I'm going to go ahead and grab value. I'm going to do a multiplication, a little asterisk there. Left square bracket, come down to conversion. Data preview of my first row of data. Again, I'm going to leave it as a string because I'm not going to do anything further from this. I run that. And oh, lo and behold, I've got my converted values column. But my stakeholders really like this style of chart. This is what my CEO, my CFO, CIO, whatever, this is what they want to see. So I've done my quick conversion here. Again, note that because I use the dynamic column, it's not going to matter what the month's names are or anything like that. So then I go ahead and I go to transform, and I'm going to grab the crosstab that we just spoke about, right? If you notice, I've got the years, I've got the column headers, and I've got my values exactly like I converted it to before. And I'm going to go ahead and group by year, which is, what I would expect. The column headers are my names, and my values are going to be my not value, because that'll give me exactly what I started before. I converted. And then, since it is a string, concatenate if there's the same, right? Note it is a string and not a number. And I run that, and it gives me pretty much what I started with, except now I've got the converted numbers in here. Now, one thing to point out about the crosstab is that you have your grouping columns, your name, and your converted. Nothing else comes through. Note that value and conversion got dropped. They don't exist in my output anymore. Maybe I do want them. So, let's group by conversion. And if I run that, I've now got year and conversion with all my months. Right? So just kind of be aware of that nuance, that anything that is not actually selected in this tool will get dropped. All right. What's another example of how we could use this? All right. Lo and behold, I got column header conversion here. I've got the month names, but I really want those to be numbers as opposed to the words. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go to the join section. And in this particular situation, I'm going to do a find and replace. And I'm going to grab my data from the same spot. Now, when I look at this, the name is what I want to find. The month abbreviation is what I'm looking for. And I want to replace it because this is text and numbers and all that kind of stuff. Let me go ahead and do a quick select tool in here. And I'm going to change the numbers to a V string. Right? And I'm going to do a replacement for these. And now when I go ahead and run that, I've now got month numbers as opposed to the words. Now I did that a little bit fast. So when I was looking at this, I noticed that this right here gave me my numbers as numbers. But over here, I was looking at my numbers as text. And it can't replace text values in a numbers field and vice versa. So I had to convert this real quickly to a string so that they were the same data type there. All right. Now, I've converted them to the months. I'm going to go ahead and just throw a sort tool on there. And I'm going to go ahead and sort by year and by name. Run that. So now I can see it. Alteryx doesn't need these so much, but so I can see it a little bit easier. Then I kind of come back and I go ahead and grab that crosstab tool again. Note, almost exactly like we did up here. We're just, changing it in a slightly different way. Group by year. Column headers to name. Value. Sum. And now I've got the exact same chart, but I've changed my column headers. So maybe I pivot my data down because I want to manipulate the names of all my column headers, and then I pivot my data back up. Maybe I want to do treatments. It's just oftentimes easier to work with data that's in a solid column because you can do everything to it at once, as opposed to having it in multiple columns where I've got to make 12 different formulas and the column headers matter and stuff like that. So, a couple of different reasons for using this, a couple of different approaches. All right, let me go ahead and do a larger example for you guys. So, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start with the transpose tool here, and I'm going to drag that all the way down here. And I'm going to grab my bookings. Right, so we're doing pretty much exactly what we did before. I'm going to have a key column of year, and everything else, including dynamic, is checked down here. And I'm going to run that. And as we'd expect, like we saw before, we got exactly the same thing. Now, I'm going to grab a select tool, put a select tool on that. And I'm going to put a select tool on that just so that it's a little bit simpler to understand. Okay, now, my names are my months, and my values are going to be my sales. All I'm doing is renaming columns. Remember in the beginning, I said this would be one of those bread and butter tools that we use on a regular basis all the time. Okay, now, a couple things that I'm going to do with this. First thing I'd like to do is I would like to find out what my yearly sums are. All right, simple enough. Let me go ahead and grab a transformation tool. And I'm going to go ahead and grab a summarize. I'm going to hook it up here. And I'm going to go ahead and summarize by year. So year is going to be my group by. And then sales, I'm going to sum that. And I'm just going to call that sales. So I got my year and my sales. Now, I'd like to note, very, very similar, if not exactly like the example I did up here. I've got year, month, and sales. I've got year and sales. And no, this is one of the reasons that I didn't use sum of sales, but I use sales because I want to align those columns again. So I'm going to go to preparation, drag down a formula tool. And with that formula tool, I'm going to create a new column called month. And I'm going to put a total in there. All right, let me run that. So now I've got year, sales, and month. Year, sales, and month. Yeah, I bet you guys can see this coming at this point. I'm going to grab a union tool, connect both of those data sets into the union tool. Stacks the data on top of each other. So there's my totals at the very bottom. And now I go into the transform. I'm going to go ahead and grab that crosstab. Group by year. Column headers will be month. Sales, obviously you do need to choose something at the very bottom. I run that. And now I've got all of my years with the totals column at the very end. All right, that works. I like that. But I want to do more with this data set, not just that. Right, so I'd also like to get my monthly totals. Not just the yearly, but how much am I doing on a monthly basis? All right, so I can go ahead and grab a summarize tool. And I'm going to hook that up. And with this summarize tool, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, let's group by month this time and go to sales and get a sum. And I'm going to call this total. And then run it. And now I have a total for every month. Now I can go ahead and I can go up to the crosstab tool again, right? Similar to what we did up here. And I'm going to pivot this data. And so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say, okay, let's go ahead. And I'm not going to group it by anything because I have no groupings here. I'm going to do month and total, and then I have to pick something. And now when I run that, I've got all my totals and months down here. Now note that I'm getting very similar to what I have here. I've got all my months, but I've got this year column, which is probably where I'd want to say total and then all my values. So I can use the exact same technique that I used up here. Let me drag down a formula tool. And in that formula tool, I'm going to go ahead and create a column called year. And I'm going to put the word total in it. Whoops, I put a single quote in the beginning. There we go, the word total in it. Simple and easy. And I'm going to run that. All right, excellent. Now, what I can do is I'm going to grab a union tool. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to run this data into it. Now, in this case, I want this second line total to float all the way to the bottom of the data. So I'm going to set a specific order in this union tool. And it's going to be 1 and 2. I always want it to come that way, right? Auto-configured by name. And now what I see is that I've got my totals for each year. And then if I come down to the bottom, I've got a totals column down here and then totals for each month. Right? Maybe totals doesn't make a lot of, maybe average is better. Okay. This is one of the nice things I also like about Alteryx is that I can change things. So I come back here and instead of the sales sum, I'm going to go ahead and make it average. Where's average in here? Ignore zeros, right? And then for my word, instead, because it goes through the same process, no big deal. It's just changing the numbers, right? For my word here, instead of total, it'll say average. And now when I run that, at the very bottom, I have an average per month. And I kind of want to just highlight this to show you that as you're building your workflows, if you want to make a change, it's fairly easy just to go back and say, oh, okay, instead of the totals, I wanted the average. So I just go back and I change this and I change the word. And my basic process is still solid. I'm just changing my numbers around a little bit. All right. Now one thing I'd like to do is there's a null right here, and I don't like that null. So let's go ahead and change that null. So I come back to here, and I have a total column here. Note that I don't have a total column here yet. And I could create a total column. I could, add all this together and stuff like that. I could do whatever I want to do. But let's go ahead and go to the transformation section and grab a summarize tool and drop it down here. And I'm going to hook it up to here where I have all of my averages. And I'm going to hook that up. And I could pull this data from a variety of spots. I'm just doing it here just to be easy about it. And then I'm going to go ahead and say, okay, what I'm looking for here is my total, and I want a sum. Right? And I'm going to name this total. Right? Little foreshadowing that I'm trying to create that total column here and run that. And now I just have that one total average. Now all I need to do is tack this onto here. All right, now I go back to that join section to merging my data sets and grab a join tool. I can just drop it on the line right there. And I'm going to hook this up. Now, I don't actually have a key in this situation. So this will be one of the few times that I would join by record position. And go ahead and run that. If I look at my output, my J anchor, I've got all of my month averages and then my total average. Right? Nothing falls out. And when I look at my results, lo and behold, at the very bottom, I've now got my average column, including every month and my yearly average. So a nice way of just showing how to work with the different tools. And we brought in a couple of other tools here. Some of the formula tools and the different ways of merging data to bring it all together. So a good example of kind of bringing a lot of what we learned into a little bit more of a practical aspect of doing it. All right. So I'd like to talk the very last part here about documentation, right? We went into documentation in a little bit of detail in the first section with the comment box and the tool container. And those are what I'm going to talk about here. Now, I could grab a tool container and drag it down, and I can drag tools into the container, and I can drag tools out of the container, right? All well and good. But I find it's actually easier to just highlight what you're looking for, right click any one tool, and add to new container. Right? So this entire process I've now added as black box container. I can move the container around as a whole. I can turn it off so it won't run. Maybe I've got multiple strings of my workflow, and as I'm building and testing, I don't want other strings to run just because it absorbs time. I could minimize it. Maybe I've got a very large workflow, and I like having a bunch of little containers on here that are just this little teeny thing, and if I need to get into it, I'll go ahead and open it. Now over here on the left, we can name this container. And so instead of container 281, I'm going to name it creating all totals for everything. So now when I look at this container, I kind of know what this container does. Right? If an auditor comes by, the auditor knows what this container is doing. If I'm going to hand this off to somebody else, or somebody's going to run this in my absence, or whatever, everybody knows what this container is doing. We have lots of colors in here. I'm going to go ahead and change the fill color here, and I'll make it, say, kind of a green color. Boom. So, great way of bulking those things up in there. Now, in addition to that, I want to be a little bit more refined. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to grab these tools here and right click and add those to a container. Right? And these are my yearly sums. All right, cool. And I'm going to grab these tools. I'm going to leave that join tool out. And these are my monthly sums. Now, I don't need to because this is just a single tool, but I will. Why not? Add that. That's my yearly sums. We'll assume that's more than a single tool, but that's more of a complex calculation. So that's my grand totals. That's an average. Right? And the monthly sums, it's not actually a sum, that's monthly average. Right? And so it's kind of helping me organize things a little bit here. And I can move the containers in the containers around to make them, a little bit more understandable. Right? Now I can also add text boxes. So I'm going to drag a comment box down. I'm going to drop it in this container. And I'm going to say this is summing up my years. That's a little small to really work with there. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to change the font here. And I'm going to make it say a 16 font. I'm fine with Arial. And I can click on it. You can see, it's nice and white in there. Let me go ahead and expand that. And the white doesn't really show up very well. So I'm going to go ahead and in the background color, I'm going to make that yellow. That stands up pretty good. So I can put a description as to what this unit of tools is doing. I can put another one of these. I can actually just copy that and paste it down here. Right? And this right here is going to be monthly averages. Whoops. Summing up the tools, monthly averages. Get rid of that capital O. Right? And then I can move them around so that they're a little bit more. I do like those like straight lines and things like that. Right? I could even bring these down to maybe straight line here. Whatever looks the best in your workflow. I think when you have the more straight lines and things are a little bit more linear and I think it's a little bit easier to read, a little bit easier to understand. All right. So I've used the containers to containerize things, and I've used the comment boxes to go ahead and talk about different aspects of the workflow and whatnot. But the next thing that I can do is I could go ahead and document the tools. So I go ahead and go to the Transpose tool, and we've always been working with the configuration up here, this icon right there. But if I bring it down to the fourth icon, the annotation, anything I type in this white space will appear beneath the tool. All right, so pivot data to make it easier to work with. All right, now that appears beneath the tool. And then in this tool, go ahead and go to my annotation. I renamed the columns. All right, awesome. Now in this tool, I summed up the yearly sales. And in this tool right here, I created a column for alignment in the results. And then over here, I blended the main data with the yearly totals. And then lastly, I pivoted it for presentation. Bring that down a little bit. Right, so that looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and bring that out because that's not necessarily a part of this process. This is bringing it together, or I could bring this in, whichever works for what you're trying to do. Then maybe I document this right here. Bring everything together. And then I come down here and I do the exact same thing. This is sum the monthly totals. And pivot for presentation. And I'm going to just take this and I'm going to copy that and just paste it in because it's doing the same thing. And then this right here, actually, I made a mistake there. That is not summing, that is averaging. And this right here is the yearly average. And so, what you'll notice is that, as I'm kind of looking at these and building these, it just becomes a whole lot more clear as to what you're trying to do when you're documenting things, um, when you're kind of, getting those straight lines, putting the containers. So if I look at this, or an auditor looks at this, it's okay, well, this whole thing is creating our totals for everything. Here's where I'm summing up my years. Here's each individual step in that process. Here's where I'm getting my monthly average. And here's each individual step in that process, etc., etc. And so I can see what each tool is doing. I can see what the groups or tool are doing. It really kind of makes it a lot more understandable and a lot more approachable. So that is what I have for you today. Um, the next classes that I'll get into are going to be a little bit shorter, probably, and we'll highlight some of the more specific things. The next class that won't be in this series, but it'll be in the next grouping, will be on control containers and kind of the benefits of those. I hope you guys have enjoyed. Any questions, let me know. Thank you.